A young girl returned home from school and was left by herself for only a short time, but by the time her family came back, she had disappeared without leaving a single clue. Police officers and hundreds of volunteers searched tirelessly for weeks, yet it was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. Then, completely unexpectedly, a stunning breakthrough changed the direction of the investigation and triggered a chain of events that gripped the entire nation. In the end, the case became one of the most notorious and fiercely debated criminal investigations in Canadian history, leaving a legacy that continues to this day. Christine Jessup was born on November 29, 1974, in the small Canadian community of Queensville. It was a peaceful rural town surrounded by beautiful countryside and located near a scenic lake with a population of only around 600 residents. Because of its close-knit nature, almost everyone knew one another, and it was widely considered an incredibly safe place to raise a family. Christine lived there with her parents and her older brother, who was 5 years older than she was. She loved spending her free time outdoors with friends, riding her bicycle around the neighborhood, and playing baseball whenever she had the chance. She also had a deep affection for animals. On one occasion, when a bat flew into her bedroom while the rest of her family panicked, Christine wasn't frightened at all. Instead, she excitedly suggested keeping it as a pet. On the morning of October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine woke up early as she always did and got ready for school. Her older brother was suffering from a painful toothache, so their mother planned to drive him to a dentist in Toronto later that day. As a result, Christine would have to spend a short period alone after school until they returned. This wasn't unusual, as she had stayed home by herself many times before. Her parents trusted her because she was responsible, mature for her age, and capable of looking after herself. Before classes ended, Christine made plans to meet her best friend at a nearby park after they both got home. She then boarded the school bus, which dropped her off only a few hundred yards from her house. A few minutes later, her friend arrived at the park and waited for Christine, expecting her to show up at any moment. But as the minutes slowly passed, there was still no sign of her. After waiting for quite some time, the friend eventually gave up and headed home. She even tried calling Christine's house, but no one answered the phone. Meanwhile, Christine's mother and brother arrived back home from Toronto. Almost immediately, her mother realized Christine wasn't there. There were clear signs she had made it home after school. Her backpack had been left inside her bedroom, and the mail she had collected from the mailbox was lying in the hallway. However, several details immediately seemed unusual. Christine's bicycle was abandoned outside with its kickstand broken. She cared deeply for that bike and always made sure it was properly put away, making it highly unusual for her to leave it like that. Even stranger, her jacket was hanging on a hook so high that Christine couldn't have reached it on her own. Despite these odd details, her mother wasn't alarmed at first. She assumed Christine had simply gone out to play, something she often did, and expected her to return shortly. About an hour later, as darkness began settling over the neighborhood, her mother's concern quickly grew. Although Christine was independent, she always told her parents where she was going. She started calling the homes of Christine's friends, hoping someone had seen her. But every conversation ended the same way: no one knew where Christine was. When she finally reached Christine's best friend, the girl explained they had arranged to meet at the park, but Christine had never arrived. Realizing something was seriously wrong, Christine's mother and brother rushed out to search the streets. Because Queensville was such a small town, they were able to check every place Christine normally visited in a relatively short time, yet she was nowhere to be found. By around 7 p.m., with no sign of Christine and no explanation for her disappearance, her mother contacted the police. For the local police department, reports like this weren't especially rare. Most involved children who had stayed out playing too long or left home after a disagreement with their parents, and they were usually found safe within a matter of hours without requiring a major investigation. At first, officers approached Christine's case in much the same way. They quickly organized a search operation and asked local residents to help. Dozens of volunteers immediately joined the effort and began searching the surrounding area. Investigators also learned that after getting off the school bus, Christine had stopped at a small convenience store located between her house and the park where she planned to meet her friend. She purchased a pack of gum, but what happened after she left the store remained a complete mystery. Since surveillance cameras weren't common at the time, detectives had no way of reconstructing her exact movements. They believed she had visited the store only minutes after arriving home from school. The search continued throughout the night, but despite everyone's efforts, there was still no trace of Christine. The following day, even more volunteers joined the search while police were flooded with tips from the public. Unfortunately, none of them led anywhere. Most callers reported seeing a young girl walking along a road or riding in a passing vehicle, but no one could confirm it was Christine or provide enough information to help investigators. As the days passed with no sign of the 9-year-old, detectives gradually became convinced they were dealing with a kidnapping. In a small town where nearly everyone knew each other and the entire community was aware of Christine's disappearance, they believed it would have been nearly impossible for her to remain hidden for so long. Her mother also became convinced that Christine had not run away and that someone had taken her against her will. Despite believing that Christine would never have run away on her own, investigators still couldn't figure out where she had gone. They searched her home, but because the local police had very little experience handling major criminal cases, the investigation was far from professional. Officers went through some of Christine's belongings without first checking for fingerprints, and even allowed neighbors and family friends to enter the house before a proper forensic examination had been carried out, potentially destroying valuable evidence. Another important detail was that Christine's father was in jail when she disappeared. Just a few weeks earlier, he had been sentenced to a short prison term for a minor fraud offense. On the day Christine vanished, her mother and brother had visited him after returning from the dentist. Once investigators began to suspect that Christine had been abducted, authorities released her father so he could be with his family, and he immediately joined the desperate search for his daughter. For weeks, police and volunteers continued searching every possible location, but they couldn't uncover either Christine or any evidence explaining what had happened to her. The search area gradually expanded into the surrounding forests and open fields, yet every effort ended in disappointment. Nearly 3 months passed without any answers. Then, on December 31st, while families across the country were preparing to celebrate the new year, Christine's loved ones had nothing to celebrate. Although they still clung to the hope that she was alive somewhere, that hope was fading fast. That same day, a man living in the nearby town of Sunderland, about 35 miles from Queensville, went searching for his missing dog. As he walked through the wooded area behind his home, he noticed what appeared to be a pile of discarded trash. Curious, he walked closer, only to make a horrifying discovery: a human body. Shocked, he rushed back home and immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, they were able to identify the victim despite the body's advanced state of decomposition. Beside the remains lay a recorder with a piece of paper bearing Christine Jessup's name. It was the same recorder she had been given at school on the day she disappeared. Investigators instantly suspected they were dealing with murder. Some of Christine's clothing, including her pants and underwear, had been removed and left beside the body, while the rest remained on her. Medical examiners later confirmed that the case was a homicide. Christine had suffered multiple stab wounds, which were determined to be the cause of death, along with numerous cuts and abrasions across her body. Experts also concluded that she had been sexually assaulted and recovered foreign biological material from her underwear. Unfortunately, DNA testing did not yet exist, meaning the evidence couldn't be used to identify the attacker. Detectives believed Christine had been killed somewhere else before her body was transported to the wooded area where it was eventually discovered. They found it strange that the killer had driven roughly 35 miles to dispose of her body near Sunderland, when there were countless isolated fields and forests much closer to Queensville. Investigators theorized that the killer may have had a personal connection to Sunderland and selected the location because he knew the area well. At the same time, they were convinced the perpetrator likely lived in Queensville and knew Christine personally, since the evidence suggested she had willingly gone with him or voluntarily entered his vehicle. Detectives repeatedly questioned Christine's parents, asking whether anyone stood out as suspicious, but her mother couldn't think of anyone. Officers interviewed nearly every resident of Queensville, investigated several people with criminal records, and followed countless leads, yet none produced any meaningful results. That changed on February 14th, when detectives met with Christine's mother once again. They asked the same question one more time, and this time, she remembered something that had always seemed unusual. The Morin family lived right next door and were highly respected throughout the community. The father owned a small repair business and had earned a reputation for being able to fix almost anything. Many residents regularly turned to him for help, and he was well liked. His 6 adult children all helped operate the family business. One of them, 25-year-old Guy Paul Morin, still lived with his parents. Christine's mother recalled several things about him that now seemed odd. Unlike almost everyone else in town, Guy Paul had never taken part in the search for Christine, despite the community searching for weeks. Even after Christine's body was found, he didn't attend her funeral, despite living right next door to the family. She also described him as a quiet, introverted man who mostly kept to himself. Although he had a few friends and a girlfriend, he was very different from the rest of his outgoing family. One of his biggest passions was playing the clarinet. That small detail immediately caught the detective's attention because Christine had been carrying a recorder when she disappeared. Investigators wondered whether Guy Paul could have started a conversation about music to gain Christine's trust before luring her away. Since he had lived only a few yards from her home for years, Christine certainly would have recognized him. Detectives soon questioned Guy Paul and asked how well he knew the young girl. He claimed they had barely spoken, except for one occasion when Christine's dog had run away and he helped catch it. When asked where he had been on the afternoon Christine disappeared, he explained that he had been working about 30 miles away until approximately 3:30 p.m. After leaving work, he said he stopped at a store, visited a gas station, and finally arrived home around 5 p.m. Before ending the interview, investigators asked what he thought of Christine. He replied that she seemed like a normal, sweet little girl, but then unexpectedly added that children sometimes grew up to become corrupt. The strange comment immediately raised investigators' suspicions, prompting them to carefully examine every detail of his story. Detectives verified his work records and confirmed that he had clocked out at exactly 3:32 p.m. That meant that even if he had driven directly from work to Christine's neighborhood, his timeline would become a critical part of the investigation. According to investigators' timeline, even if Guy Paul Morin had driven directly from work, he still wouldn't have reached Christine's house before her mother returned home. Additional checks confirmed that after leaving work, he had stopped at both a grocery store and a gas station, which accounted for roughly half an hour. His family also told detectives that he arrived home around 5 p.m. and went to bed not long afterward because he was exhausted from work. Based on those facts, it appeared he simply didn't have enough time to kidnap Christine. Even so, investigators suspected that his family could have been mistaken about the exact time he got home, or worse, that they were deliberately protecting him. Detectives requested permission to examine Morin's car, and during the search they discovered several fabric fibers inside the trunk. The samples were sent to a forensic laboratory, where experts concluded that the fibers matched the sweater Christine had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Investigators also believed that several hairs recovered from Christine's body belonged to Morin, although at the time, forensic experts could only compare hair visually and identify general similarities or obvious differences, such as color, and texture. Seeking additional support for their theory, police consulted an FBI profiler who created a behavioral profile of the killer based on the available evidence. According to the profiler, the suspect was likely a man from Queensville between the ages of 19 and 26, with a criminal history involving offenses such as arson or voyeurism. While the profile included several other characteristics, detectives focused almost entirely on the parts they believed resembled Morin. In reality, he had no criminal record and was known as a quiet, law-abiding resident, meaning he matched less than half of the profile. Nevertheless, investigators had already convinced themselves that he was responsible. On April 22nd, they arrested Guy Paul Morin and charged him with Christine's murder. Morin strongly denied any involvement and was held in jail while awaiting trial. Christine's parents were devastated by the news, struggling to believe that the man who had lived next door for years could have committed such a horrific crime. However, detectives faced one major obstacle: Christine's mother's original statement that she had arrived home at exactly 4:10 p.m. She remembered checking the kitchen clock the moment she walked inside. Based on travel times, investigators knew Morin couldn't have reached the Jessup home before then and would have needed another 15 to 20 minutes after arriving. Determined to preserve their case, detectives repeatedly questioned Christine's mother, asking whether she was absolutely certain about the time or if she might have remembered it incorrectly. They insisted that Morin was the killer and suggested that only her timeline was preventing justice. Eventually, she began to doubt her own memory and admitted she might have arrived home slightly later, a change that was enough for investigators to move forward. During the trial, prosecutors portrayed Morin as an unusual loner whose behavior had long concerned members of the community. They also argued that he had enough time to abduct Christine because her mother had likely returned home later than she initially believed. As for Morin's relatives, who supported his alibi, the prosecution brought in a psychologist who claimed their statements showed signs that they were covering for him. One of the most dramatic moments in court came when an undercover police officer, who had secretly shared a jail cell with Morin before the trial, testified against him. The officer claimed Morin had discussed details of the murder, including the cause of death. However, those details had already been published in newspapers, meaning Morin wasn't revealing any information that wasn't already public. The officer also testified that Morin frequently quoted lines from his favorite movie, The Shining, during their conversations. Although Morin consistently maintained his innocence, the undercover officer's testimony, combined with the prosecution's effort to paint him as a strange and dangerous man, had a powerful influence on the jury. Despite all of this, the evidence was ultimately considered too weak and unreliable to support a conviction. The jury found Guy Paul Morin not guilty, and he walked free from the courtroom. Prosecutors immediately announced they would appeal the verdict, insisting they still believed he was guilty. Christine's family was heartbroken once again. They now faced the possibility of continuing to live only a few yards away from the man they believed had murdered their daughter. Her father later said that ever since Christine's death, their family had been living through hell, and now that nightmare would continue. Many residents of Queensville were equally outraged by the verdict. Convinced that Morin had escaped justice, some members of the community began harassing him. Threatening letters repeatedly appeared in his mailbox, and people even threw objects at his family's home. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared their appeal, arguing that the judge in the original trial had failed to properly explain the legal standard of reasonable doubt to the jury. That argument was enough for a higher court to order a second trial, which finally began in 1991, several years after Christine's murder. As preparations got underway, disturbing new information about the investigation became public. It was revealed that the forensic expert who claimed the fibers from Morin's car matched Christine's sweater had worn a sweater made from the same material and color while conducting the comparison, raising serious concerns about contamination. Even more alarming, by the time the second trial began, much of the physical evidence had mysteriously disappeared. The fabric fibers and several hairs recovered from Christine's body and clothing were gone. Investigators also discovered that several of Christine's bones had been lost, along with a cigarette butt found near her body. Shockingly, the cigarette had never even been entered into the official case file, possibly because Morin wasn't a smoker, and it didn't support the prosecution's theory. Despite these serious problems, the second trial moved forward. This time, prosecutors argued that when Christine returned home from school carrying her recorder, Morin noticed the instrument, took out his clarinet, and began playing music. According to their theory, Christine approached him out of curiosity, after which Morin forced her into his car, drove her to another location, and murdered her. Even the prosecution admitted the theory relied heavily on speculation, yet in July 1992, the jury unanimously found Guy Paul Morin guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. By then, however, public opinion had shifted dramatically. In the early years of the case, newspapers had portrayed Morin as an odd and dangerous outsider, but after details of the flawed investigation became public, the narrative completely changed. Increasingly, the media suggested that Morin was actually an innocent man whose life had been destroyed by police incompetence and tunnel vision. Following the conviction, a group of concerned citizens organized a campaign to challenge the verdict. Under mounting public pressure, Morin's lawyer filed another appeal, and in an extremely rare decision, Morin was released on bail while waiting for the appeal to be heard. The bail was set at nearly $500,000, forcing his parents to mortgage their home because it was the only way they could raise the money. Morin's legal team also requested a new DNA analysis of the biological material recovered from Christine's underwear. Earlier attempts had failed because forensic technology simply wasn't advanced enough. But by the mid-1990s, scientific breakthroughs allowed experts to develop a complete DNA profile from the semen sample preserved on the fabric. The results were definitive. The DNA did not belong to Guy Paul Morin. The revelation sent shockwaves across Canada. By then, Morin had spent roughly a year and a half behind bars and endured years of investigations and court proceedings that had effectively destroyed his reputation and his life. Many believed police had become so determined to prove he was guilty that they ignored evidence pointing elsewhere. In January 1995, exactly 10 years after Christine's body had been found, all charges against Guy Paul Morin were officially dismissed, and he was finally declared a free man. He later sued the government and received $1.2 million in compensation. Several investigators involved in the case either faced disciplinary action, legal consequences, or lost their jobs. The case also prompted some of the most significant reforms to Canada's criminal justice system, introducing new safeguards designed to prevent similar miscarriages of justice. After Morin's exoneration, authorities reopened Christine's murder investigation with an entirely new team of detectives. Armed with the real killer's DNA profile, investigators began collecting samples from hundreds of men who could potentially have been involved, but none matched the evidence. Since then, the investigation has made very little progress. Responsibility for the case was eventually transferred to the Cold Case Unit, which periodically reviewed the evidence but failed to identify any new suspects. One of the greatest obstacles was the damage done by the original investigation. Detectives had not only lost critical evidence, but had also failed to thoroughly investigate alternative suspects because they became completely fixated on proving Guy Paul Morin's guilt. As the years passed, Canadian media continued reporting on Christine's murder, and after one particular story published by a major news outlet. Following a major news report, journalists began receiving several intriguing tips from members of the public. One man claimed that his father had confessed to murdering Christine while lying on his deathbed, while others pointed investigators towards several individuals with suspicious backgrounds who had lived in Queensville at the time of the crime. Reporters forwarded every lead to the police, but despite investigating them, none of the names could be conclusively connected to Christine's murder. In 2019, exactly 35 years after the crime, authorities reopened the investigation once again. A new detective was assigned to the cold case, and with nothing more than the unknown killer's DNA profile, he decided to pursue a relatively new investigative technique, genetic genealogy. Since no Canadian laboratory specialized in this highly advanced process, the detective reached out to a company in the United States and requested funding from his superiors. After receiving approval, forensic experts began comparing the killer's DNA against publicly available genealogy databases in search of distant relatives. They successfully identified several people who shared portions of the unknown suspect's DNA, but tracing each family tree individually would have taken years. Instead, the experts cross-referenced all of the relatives they had found, allowing them to dramatically narrow the search. Eventually, they concluded that investigators would only need to examine the family trees of roughly 400 individuals to identify the owner of the DNA sample. Armed with that information, the detective contacted another specialist in Canada who had extensive experience in forensic DNA analysis. The expert agreed to help and began painstakingly reconstructing the family trees himself. To ensure the investigation remained completely objective, he intentionally withheld his findings from the detective, so there would be no chance of bias influencing the case if a familiar name appeared. Over the next 8 months, he and his team carefully analyzed countless family records before focusing on one particular lineage. At the top of that family tree was a man born in 1804, and investigators methodically examined hundreds of his descendants. Finally, in October 2020, they identified one family that stood out above all the others. After eliminating every unlikely candidate, they arrived at a single name that fit every requirement: Calvin Hoover. When they presented the results to the detective, he was completely surprised. He had never heard of Hoover before. The name didn't appear anywhere in the original investigation, nor was it mentioned among the thousands of tips collected over more than 3 decades. Curious, the detective began looking into Hoover's background and quickly uncovered a shocking revelation. Calvin Hoover had been one of Christine Jessup's parents' closest friends. At the time of Christine's murder, Hoover was 28 years old and lived in Queensville with his wife and children. The two families had known each other for years, and Hoover was even listed as Christine's family's emergency contact. Even more astonishing, only a few days before Christine disappeared, her mother had visited the Hoover family. During that visit, she told Hoover's wife that after taking her son to the dentist, she planned to visit her husband in prison, but would leave Christine at home because she was too young to accompany them. That meant Hoover's wife knew exactly when Christine would be home alone, and because Calvin Hoover was also in the house during that conversation, investigators believed he could easily have overheard those plans. Christine knew Hoover well and would have had no reason to fear him. As a trusted family friend, she likely would have willingly gotten into his vehicle or gone with him without hesitation. The detective then wondered why Hoover's name had never become a suspect if he had been so close to Christine's family. As he reviewed the original case files, he uncovered yet another disturbing oversight. Shortly after Christine's body was discovered, police had interviewed Hoover's wife. She explained that she hadn't been home when Christine disappeared, but stated that her husband had stayed behind to look after their young children. Instead of verifying that statement or interviewing Hoover directly, investigators simply accepted his wife's account as an alibi and moved on. Incredibly, they never questioned him at all. That meant Hoover had both the opportunity and the access to commit the crime, leaving detectives with only one final task: confirming his DNA. Unfortunately, another major obstacle stood in the way. Calvin Hoover had died in 2015 after battling serious health problems. Since the suspect was already deceased, obtaining a direct DNA sample seemed almost impossible. The detective considered requesting an exhumation, but after 5 years there was no guarantee that usable biological evidence would still exist. Then, the investigation took an unexpected turn. When detectives contacted the medical examiner's office that had handled Hoover's death, they learned that 2 vials of his blood had been preserved. The samples were immediately sent to a forensic laboratory, where scientists extracted a complete DNA profile. When they compared Hoover's DNA to the biological evidence recovered from Christine's clothing decades earlier, the result was undeniable, a perfect match. Calvin Hoover was the man responsible for Christine Jessup's murder. Christine's parents were stunned by the revelation. For decades, they had never once suspected that one of their closest friends had been the killer. They were devastated to learn that Hoover had lived out the rest of his life surrounded by his family, never facing justice for what he had done. Hoover's own relatives were equally shocked when investigators informed them of the results. His wife later said she had never imagined that her husband could have had any connection to Christine's murder. Guy Paul Morin also spoke publicly after the real killer was finally identified. He explained that the discovery changed nothing for him personally. Between wrongful imprisonment and years spent fighting for his freedom in court, nearly a decade of his life had been taken away. Even after being completely exonerated, many people still believed he was guilty. Morin said he spent years living in constant fear, and even now, those memories continue to haunt him. In the end, he reflected that Christine's murder had not only stolen the life of an innocent little girl, but it also destroyed his own. Share your thoughts on this heartbreaking case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A teenage girl left her gymnastics practice and began walking home, a journey of only a few hundred yards, but she never arrived. Her sudden disappearance triggered one of the largest police searches Italy had ever seen. As the investigation unfolded, the case became one of the country's most infamous criminal mysteries, captivating millions and taking turns so unbelievable that they seemed straight out of a detective thriller. Few could have imagined that the truth behind the case would be even stranger than fiction. Yara Gambarasio was born on May 21, 1997, in the small Italian town of Brembette di Sopra. Located not far from Milan, the quiet community was home to just over 7,000 residents and was known for its peaceful atmosphere, historic buildings, and beautiful countryside. Yara's family had lived there for generations. She grew up with loving parents, an older sister, and 2 younger brothers. She enjoyed spending time with friends, attended the local school, and had a passion for gymnastics. Just a short walk from her house stood a large sports center where she trained several times each week. On November 26, 2010, 13-year-old Yara planned to make a quick stop at the gym to return a stereo to her coach. At around 5:15 p.m., she said goodbye to her parents and left the house, telling them she would be back within an hour. Her parents had no reason to worry. Brembette di Sopra was considered an extremely safe town, and the sports center was only a few minutes away on foot. But as the evening wore on, Yara still hadn't returned. By 7 p.m., her parents knew something wasn't right, because she was never late without letting them know. At 7:11 p.m., her mother tried calling her cell phone, but it immediately went to voicemail. Alarmed, her parents contacted the police without delay. The investigation was assigned to a police department in a larger nearby city, where experienced detective Letizia Ruggeri took charge of the case. She immediately dispatched officers to Brembette di Sopra and requested assistance from Italy's military police to begin an extensive search. After interviewing Yara's parents, investigators headed to the sports center to reconstruct her final known movements. Her gymnastics coach confirmed that Yara had arrived at around 5:30 p.m. Friends also reported seeing her there, chatting with them, watching part of the practice, and even doing a few exercises before leaving for home. Investigators also discovered that at 6:44 p.m., Yara had sent a text message to one of her friends. It would become the last known communication she ever made. Based on the timeline, detectives concluded that Yara had vanished somewhere along the short route between the sports center and her home. Officers divided into multiple search teams. Some combed the surrounding streets while others searched for witnesses, surveillance cameras, and any clues that could reveal what had happened. Several people who had been near the sports center that evening reported seeing a young girl resembling Yara talking to two men standing beside a red car. However, investigators were never able to confirm whether the girl they saw was actually Yara. Police thoroughly searched the entire sports complex, but found no trace of her. At the same time, local officers, military police, firefighters, and hundreds of volunteers spread across nearby roads, fields, and the banks of a small river that ran through the town. Despite the enormous search effort, Yara seemed to have vanished without a trace. Detective Ruggieri then called in specialized canine units. The search dogs picked up Yara's scent from her personal belongings, but instead of leading officers toward her home, they followed a trail in the opposite direction, pointing toward the nearby town of Mopello. Around the same time, Ruggieri requested Yara's mobile phone records. The data revealed that her phone had connected to a cell tower in Mopello at 6:49 p.m., just 5 minutes after she had sent her final text message. Considering the distance involved, investigators concluded that it would have been impossible for Yara to reach Mopello on foot in such a short time. Someone had almost certainly transported her there in a vehicle. At that point, the investigation reached a dead end, and detectives focused on two possible explanations. The first, and by far the most likely, was that Yara had been abducted. The second was that she had chosen to run away, although investigators found that theory difficult to believe. In her final text message, Yara had been making plans to meet a friend the following day, giving no indication that she intended to disappear. Even so, detectives thoroughly questioned her relatives, friends, classmates, and everyone close to her. But nothing suggested problems at home or any reason for her to leave voluntarily. Determined to leave no possibility unexplored, Detective Ruggieri authorized wiretaps on the phones of Yara's family members and dozens of other people connected to the investigation. She also made an unprecedented request for the mobile phone records of every device that had connected to the cell towers in Mopello on the evening Yara disappeared. If she had indeed been kidnapped, the kidnapper's phone would likely have appeared among those records. However, finding that single device among an enormous volume of data would prove to be an extraordinary challenge. In total, investigators eventually obtained records for nearly 15,000 mobile phones that had connected to cell towers in the area on the evening Yara disappeared. Every one of those numbers had to be examined, so police formed a special task force dedicated to identifying the owners of thousands of phones that appeared suspicious for one reason or another. Meanwhile, the physical search for Yara continued every single day, but despite the enormous effort, investigators found nothing. As time passed, Detective Leticia Ruggieri began losing hope that traditional search methods would lead anywhere. She became convinced that the key to solving the case lay within those thousands of phone records, believing that one of them almost certainly belonged to the kidnapper. Over the following days, officers listened to thousands of hours of intercepted phone calls, yet none seemed connected to Yara's disappearance. That changed toward the end of November, when one investigator suddenly heard what sounded like a shocking confession. During a recorded conversation, a man appeared to say, "Forgive me, Lord. I didn't kill her." Detectives quickly identified the caller as Mohammed Fikri, a Moroccan construction worker who lived in the same town where Yara's phone had last connected to a cell tower. Officers immediately tried to locate him, but they ran into a major problem. Because there were simply too many calls to monitor in real time, the surveillance team was reviewing recordings several days after they were made. By the time Fikri's conversation was heard, 3 days had already passed, and he was aboard a ferry heading back to Morocco. To investigators, the timing looked extremely suspicious. Italian authorities ordered the ship to be intercepted, arrested Fikri, and brought him back to Italy for questioning. Around the same time, detectives searched his vehicle and made another unsettling discovery. Inside the trunk was a mattress covered with bloodstains. The mattress was rushed to a forensic laboratory, but the results took the investigation in a completely different direction. The blood wasn't Yara's, and in fact, it wasn't even human. As investigators continued examining the phone recording, they uncovered an even bigger mistake. Experts fluent in Fikri's native language determined that the original translation was incorrect. The officer who first listened to the recording had misunderstood what Fikri had actually said, completely changing the meaning of the conversation. After conducting additional background checks and verifying his movements, detectives concluded that Mohammed Fikri had absolutely no connection to Yara's disappearance and were forced to release him. By then, Yara's case had become one of the biggest news stories in Italy. National media covered every development, and millions of people followed the investigation, desperately hoping she would be found alive. When newspapers reported Fikri's arrest, many believed police had finally captured the person responsible. Learning that he was innocent came as both a shock and a huge disappointment, leaving investigators right back where they had started with no viable suspects and no meaningful leads. Police continued monitoring phone records, searching for evidence, and pursuing every possible clue. But nothing brought them any closer to Yara. That frustrating stalemate lasted exactly 3 months. Then, on February 26, 2011, everything changed. That afternoon, a man from a small town about 6 miles from Yara's home went to a nearby field to fly his remote-controlled airplane. While flying, the aircraft developed a problem, forcing him to land it in an area of tall, dense grass to avoid crashing. As he walked over to retrieve it, he noticed what looked like a pile of old rags lying on the ground. At first, he paid little attention, but then he spotted a pair of boots sticking out from beneath the pile. Realizing something was terribly wrong, he immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they discovered a human body hidden beneath the clothing. The remains had decomposed so severely that visual identification was almost impossible. However, when Detective Letizia Ruggeri reached the scene, she instantly recognized the victim as Yara. She was still wearing the same clothes she had on the day she walked to the sports center nearly 3 months earlier. Investigators also recovered several of her personal belongings nearby, including her iPod, house keys, SIM card, and the removable battery from her cell phone. Strangely, the phone itself was missing. Italy's leading forensic pathologist was called in to perform the autopsy. She concluded that Yara had died from multiple stab wounds. Although she found no evidence that Yara had been sexually assaulted, some of her clothing had been removed, leading detectives to suspect that sexual assault may still have been the intended motive. Forensic experts also discovered unusual fibers on Yara's body that were commonly used in a specific type of industrial fabric, suggesting the killer may have worked in a manufacturing facility somewhere in the region. In addition, scientists recovered 2 separate foreign DNA samples, one from Yara's gloves and another from the battery of her phone. Unfortunately, both samples were extremely small, making it difficult to obtain complete genetic profiles. To make matters worse, neither sample matched anyone in national DNA databases, leaving investigators at yet another dead end. Then, 2 months later, Detective Ruggeri received an unexpected phone call from the forensic laboratory. While conducting a more detailed examination of Yara's clothing, experts had discovered additional biological material on her underwear. This time, they successfully extracted a complete DNA profile from an unknown male. For the first time, investigators had what they believed was the killer's DNA. Armed with this crucial breakthrough, Ruggeri reorganized the investigation. Multiple teams of officers were assigned different responsibilities. Some collected DNA samples from Yara's relatives, friends, classmates, coaches, and everyone connected to the sports center. Others focused on analyzing mobile phone records, identifying people whose phones had traveled from Yara's town to Mapello on the night she disappeared, before obtaining DNA samples from those individuals as well. Because of the enormous scale of the operation, results came in painfully slowly. Even with 3 forensic laboratories across Italy working around the clock, processing the thousands of DNA samples was expected to take years. In the months that followed, investigators collected DNA from thousands of people, yet not a single sample matched the unknown profile recovered from Yara's clothing. As progress stalled once again, Detective Ruggeri searched for another way forward. Eventually, she came up with an unconventional idea. Not far from the field where Yara's body had been discovered stood a popular nightclub. Based on her experience, Ruggeri knew that killers often dispose of victims in places they know well. The nightclub also had a reputation for attracting individuals with criminal backgrounds and other questionable characters. Believing it was worth investigating, she decided to collect DNA from everyone entering the club. Officers were stationed outside every Friday and Saturday night, taking DNA samples from visitors as they arrived. Since all customers were required to hold membership cards, investigators also gained access to records identifying everyone who had visited the nightclub in previous years. Although Ruggeri admitted the chances of success were slim, she was determined to explore every possible lead. Then, before long, the laboratory called with an unexpected development. The breakthrough finally came when DNA collected from one of the nightclub visitors produced a partial match to the unknown profile recovered from Yara's clothing. The man's name was Damiano. At first, investigators believed they had found their suspect, but there was one major problem. The match was only partial, and further investigation quickly ruled him out because he had been on another continent at the time Yara disappeared. Even so, the result was incredibly important. Forensic experts concluded that if Damiano shared part of the killer's DNA, he was almost certainly related to the person they were looking for. Detective Letizia Ruggeri and her team immediately shifted their focus to Damiano's family, hoping to identify the true perpetrator. At the time, this type of investigation was highly unusual. Genetic genealogy was still in its infancy, making the process both groundbreaking and extraordinarily difficult. As detectives dug deeper into Damiano's family history, they uncovered an astonishing coincidence. Damiano's mother had worked as a housekeeper for Yara's family for nearly 10 years before leaving the job several years earlier. When she learned that someone from her own family might be connected to the murder, she was completely devastated. Despite this unexpected lead, months passed without any significant progress. Eventually, Detective Ruggeri determined that none of Damiano's immediate relatives could have been responsible. That meant investigators would have to expand the search to hundreds, perhaps even thousands of more distant family members. As the investigation dragged on with no visible results, public criticism intensified. Newspapers and television programs began accusing Ruggeri and her team of incompetence, claiming they had no real strategy for solving the case. Several politicians even demanded that she be removed from the investigation, although none of those attempts succeeded. Ignoring the growing pressure, Ruggeri continued pushing forward. Together with her team, she painstakingly reconstructed enormous family trees and examined historical records dating all the way back to 1716. Thousands of names were reviewed, yet every promising lead eventually ended in disappointment. Finally, in September 2011, investigators made another critical breakthrough. One family tree led them to a man named Giuseppe Garanoni, who had already passed away years earlier. Fortunately, his widow had kept several old postage stamps that still contained traces of his saliva. Forensic experts carefully extracted DNA from the stamps and compared it to the unknown profile. The results were remarkable. The analysis indicated that Giuseppe was almost certainly either the father or grandfather of the unidentified killer, whose DNA had been recovered from Yara's underwear. Investigators immediately turned their attention to Giuseppe's 2 sons and collected DNA samples from both of them. Once again, however, the investigation hit an unexpected obstacle. Although both men showed a close genetic relationship to the unknown suspect, neither of them was an exact match. Detective Ruggieri was left with a baffling mystery. The killer clearly belonged to this family, yet none of the known male descendants fit the evidence. After reviewing every possibility, investigators arrived at one final theory. They began to suspect that Giuseppe had secretly fathered a child with another woman, someone his own family had never known about. Proving such a secret decades later was incredibly challenging. Detectives interviewed thousands of people who might have known Giuseppe during his lifetime, searching for any clue that could support the theory. Nearly a year later, they finally uncovered something unusual. Since the 1960s, Giuseppe had traveled every May to a spa resort in a small town near Milan, always staying for 2 weeks without his wife or family. Detective Ruggieri requested visitor records from the resort, and to her surprise, the documents had been preserved. Investigators carefully examined the records and created a list of every woman who had stayed at the spa during the same periods as Giuseppe. Even this painstaking process stretched on for more than a year, but Ruggieri still couldn't identify the woman who might have been the mother of his secret child. As news of the investigation spread, the media became fascinated by the theory that Giuseppe had fathered an unknown son. Journalists across Italy launched investigations of their own, searching for people born from secret relationships. In one small village alone, reporters uncovered 5 different cases involving children born from extramarital affairs. Despite the enormous public attention, investigators continued reaching dead ends. That changed in 2014. After years of searching, police finally received a tip suggesting that Giuseppe may have had a relationship with a woman named Esther Artsufi. When investigators reviewed their files, they made a surprising discovery. They had actually collected Esther's DNA 2 years earlier. At the time, laboratory results had concluded that she wasn't related to the unknown suspect. Even so, Detective Ruggieri requested that the sample be tested again. The new analysis uncovered a shocking mistake. During the original examination, a forensic expert had accidentally compared the killer's DNA to Yara's DNA instead of Esther's. Once another expert performed the correct comparison, the results left no doubt. Esther Arzufi was the biological mother of the man whose DNA had been found on Yara's clothing. With that crucial piece of the puzzle finally confirmed, investigators learned that Esther had 3 children, including a set of twins, a son and a daughter who perfectly matched the expected age range. Officially, the twins were believed to be the children of Esther's husband. However, detectives now suspected that Giuseppe Garanoni had actually been their biological father. Since the unknown suspect was male, investigators immediately focused on Esther's son. At the time, the man was 42 years old, worked in construction, and lived with his wife and children in Mapello, the very same town where Yara's cell phone signal had last been detected. Detective Ruggieri quickly devised a discreet plan to obtain his DNA without alerting him to the investigation. After learning which road he regularly used, officers set up what appeared to be a routine sobriety checkpoint. Completely unaware of the real purpose, the man was asked to blow into a breathalyzer. The device was immediately preserved and sent to the forensic laboratory, where scientists extracted ney from the saliva he had left behind. Nearly 4 years after Yara disappeared, Detective Ruggieri finally received the confirmation she had been waiting for. The DNA profile was a perfect match to the biological evidence recovered from Yara's underwear. The man's name was Massimo Bossetti, and on June 16, he was arrested for Yara's murder. Bossetti denied every accusation and insisted he was innocent, forcing the case to proceed to trial. As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators uncovered several disturbing pieces of evidence that appeared to strengthen their suspicions. His internet browsing history contained searches involving inappropriate material related to minors. On the evening Yara disappeared, his mobile phone had connected to cell towers in her hometown before being switched off at 5:45 p.m. It remained powered down until the following morning. Investigators also discovered surveillance footage showing Bossetti's vehicle driving near the sports center only minutes before Yara vanished. Unfortunately, because the cameras failed to capture the license plates, identifying the vehicle with complete certainty proved difficult. Before Massimo Bossetti was arrested, investigators couldn't prove who had been driving the vehicle captured on surveillance cameras near the sports center. But once he was taken into custody, they confirmed that the car in the footage was indeed his. Forensic experts also discovered that fibers taken from the seats of Bossetti's vehicle matched the same type of fibers found on Yara's body, further strengthening the prosecution's case. Prosecutors also presented testimony from a woman who lived in Yara's neighborhood. She told the court that on the evening Yara disappeared, she stepped outside to throw away some trash when she saw a car speeding past her house. Based on its appearance, she believed it closely resembled Bossetti's vehicle. She also claimed she saw a child inside the car and heard screams coming from it as it drove away. Investigators uncovered another important detail as well. Bossetti regularly visited a pizza restaurant located on the same street as Yara's home, leading prosecutors to believe he may have noticed her long before the abduction and could have been watching her in the days or even weeks leading up to the crime. When confronted with the surveillance footage, Bossetti insisted he had simply been driving home from work that evening. However, investigators proved that he hadn't worked that day at all. His co-workers confirmed he was absent, and both surveillance footage and mobile phone records supported that conclusion. The trial finally began in the summer of 2015, roughly 1 year after Bossetti's arrest, and quickly became one of the most closely watched court cases in modern Italian history. Millions of people followed every hearing, convinced they were about to witness the resolution of a mystery that had gripped the nation for years. Although public opinion largely viewed Bossetti as the killer, few expected the trial to produce so many unexpected twists. Prosecutors argued that Bossetti had likely been observing Yara for an extended period before finally acting. According to their theory, he waited until she left the sports center alone, abducted her, drove her to the isolated field where her body was later found, and murdered her there. They believed his original intention had been to sexually assault Yara, but that, for reasons investigators could never fully explain, the assault was never completed. Bossetti's wife took the witness stand and claimed that her husband had been home eating dinner with the family when Yara disappeared. However, her testimony conflicted with surveillance footage near the sports center, as well as statements from 3 independent witnesses who reported seeing Bossetti's vehicle in the area at the exact time he claimed to have been at home. The defense maintained that Bossetti was completely innocent. Bossetti himself explained that he frequently suffered from nosebleeds, suggesting that traces of his blood could easily have ended up on his clothing or work equipment. His attorney proposed an alternative theory, arguing that the real killer may somehow have come into contact with Bossetti's blood before committing the crime, causing it to be transferred onto Yara's underwear. The defense also challenged the DNA evidence itself. Their experts explained that human DNA contains different types of genetic markers, some that vary greatly even among close relatives, and others that change very little across generations. Because the DNA recovered from Yara's clothing involved the more slowly changing genetic markers, the defense argued that it could theoretically belong to another member of Bossetti's extended family rather than Bossetti himself. Prosecutors strongly rejected that argument, insisting that the complete DNA profile matched Bossetti with overwhelming certainty and left virtually no room for doubt. But the defense wasn't finished. During the trial, they introduced a completely new suspect, creating one of the biggest surprises of the entire case. They pointed to a gymnastics instructor named Sylvia. After Yara's body had been discovered, forensic experts found traces of Sylvia's blood on the sleeve of Yara's jacket. Even more unusual, Sylvia's father later revealed that she had come home on the night Yara disappeared and spent the entire evening crying uncontrollably. Investigators also learned that Sylvia had exchanged several text messages with her brother that same night, but both siblings deleted the messages shortly afterward, leaving no record of what had been discussed. When questioned in court, Sylvia claimed she couldn't remember why she had been so upset, what she had written in the deleted messages, or how her blood had somehow ended up on Yara's clothing. Faced with repeated questions, she offered little more than the same response over and over: "I don't know." Although these revelations raised new questions, investigators found no evidence directly linking Sylvia to the murder. Ultimately, prosecutors presented enough evidence for the jury to convict Bassetti. In the summer of 2016, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. His legal team filed multiple appeals, but every attempt to overturn the conviction was unsuccessful. An unusual twist followed immediately after the verdict. The day after Bassetti was sentenced, his wife visited him in prison and confessed that none of their 3 children were biologically his, admitting that she had been unfaithful with several other men during their marriage. Ironically, the investigation had already revealed another extraordinary family secret. Esther Arzuffi's 3rd child had been fathered neither by her husband nor by Giuseppe Garanoni, but by an entirely different man. Since his conviction, Bassetti has remained behind bars. Even today, however, the mystery surrounding Sylvia and the unexplained traces of her blood continues to fuel debate among those who closely followed the case. Some believe those unanswered questions cast doubt on Bassetti's guilt, and even speculate that he may have been wrongly convicted, or that the DNA evidence was somehow manipulated. Nevertheless, the case remains one of the most extensively investigated criminal cases in modern Italian history. The forensic evidence was reviewed by some of the country's leading experts, and the overwhelming consensus remains that the likelihood of Bassetti's innocence is extremely small. Share your thoughts on this remarkable case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A young woman traveled home to spend the weekend with her family, but before she could return to the city, she vanished without leaving a single clue. Police officers, joined by dozens of local residents, immediately launched a large-scale search, and it wasn't long before they made a disturbing discovery. But as investigators slowly uncovered the full story behind the crime, the case sparked outrage across the country and remained the subject of intense public debate for years. Vanessa Marcotte was born on June 17, 1989, in the small town of Leominster, Massachusetts. Her parents separated shortly after she was born. But despite the divorce, her father remained a constant presence in her life. He continued living nearby and made every effort to spend as much time with his daughter as possible. Thanks to him, Vanessa developed a deep appreciation for nature and outdoor activities from a young age. Together, they spent countless weekends hiking, skiing in the nearby mountains, and enjoying trips to the beach. As she grew older, Vanessa discovered a passion for yoga and long-distance running, eventually participating in 2 major charity marathons. She was equally committed to her education and dreamed of building a successful career. After graduating from high school, Vanessa attended Boston University, where she earned a degree in communications. She worked for several local companies before achieving one of her biggest goals, accepting a position at Google, which required her to relocate to New York City. Vanessa loved her new job and was determined to advance within the company. Despite her demanding career, she always found time to volunteer and support charitable causes, believing strongly in helping others whenever she could. No matter how busy life became, she also made a point of visiting her family whenever possible. By then, her relatives were living in the quiet town of Princeton, Massachusetts, not far from her hometown and roughly 180 miles from New York City. In early August 2016, 27-year-old Vanessa returned to Princeton for a weekend visit and stayed at her mother's house. She spent time catching up with family members, meeting old friends, and planned to travel back to New York on Sunday, August 7. That morning, she relaxed at home with her mother before deciding to go for a run in the afternoon. With several hours remaining before her scheduled bus departure, she had plenty of time to enjoy her usual exercise. Vanessa chose a familiar route along a nearby road close to her mother's home. Although a handful of houses lined the area, most were hidden behind dense woods, making the road feel quiet and isolated. She expected to be back within about 30 minutes, but she never returned. As time passed, her mother began growing increasingly concerned. Vanessa still needed to finish packing and catch her bus back to New York, something she would never have ignored. She repeatedly called Vanessa's cell phone, but there was no answer. About an hour after Vanessa had left the house, her phone suddenly began going straight to voicemail, making the situation even more alarming. Desperate for an explanation, her mother hoped Vanessa might have unexpectedly decided to visit friends or stop by another relative's home before leaving town. She contacted everyone she could think of, but no one had seen or heard from Vanessa. Fearing the worst, she called the police. Officers immediately responded, interviewed Vanessa's mother, and began searching the route she had planned to jog. Family members, friends, and local residents quickly joined the effort, determined to find her safe. Vanessa's bus to New York was scheduled to leave at 5:30 p.m., and everyone hoped she would appear before it departed. But when the bus pulled away without her, investigators realized they were dealing with something far more serious. Vanessa was known for being dependable and dedicated to her work. Missing the last bus back to New York without contacting anyone was completely out of character. As the search continued into the evening, the local police requested assistance from the Massachusetts State Police, who deployed additional officers along with specialized search dogs. Vanessa's father was deeply involved in the search and desperately searched alongside investigators. His emotional state became so overwhelming that officers eventually asked him to step away because his distress was beginning to interfere with the operation. At approximately 8:20 p.m., one of the search teams ventured deeper into a wooded area less than a mile from Vanessa's mother's house. Guided by the search dogs, officers followed a scent trail into the forest, where they soon made a devastating discovery. Lying on the ground was the body of a young woman. Despite the severe injuries, investigators immediately recognized her as Vanessa Marcotte. Most of her clothing was missing, with only one sneaker lying near the scene. In addition to numerous bruises covering her body, detectives noticed clear signs of burning, and even the abandoned sneaker had been partially scorched. Investigators believed the killer had likely attempted to destroy both the body and other evidence by setting them on fire. But for reasons unknown, the attempt had failed. Detectives also suspected that Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, believing it may have been the motive behind the attack. They quickly realized that several of her personal belongings, including her clothing, headphones, and cell phone, were missing from the scene. Since none of those items could be located nearby, investigators believed the killer had taken them while leaving the area. Vanessa's body was transported to the medical examiner's office as detectives began the difficult task of identifying a suspect. News of the murder spread rapidly throughout Princeton, leaving residents shocked and terrified. Their small community had long been considered one of the safest places in the region, and more than 3 decades had passed since the town's last homicide. Now, with news of Vanessa's brutal murder spreading across the community, fear quickly replaced the sense of security that residents had always taken for granted. As details of the horrific crime became public, the quiet town was overwhelmed by fear. Residents began wondering whether the killer was someone from their own community, and many worried that he might strike again before police could identify him. During the autopsy, medical examiners determined that Vanessa had died from strangulation. They also documented numerous injuries across her body, many of which suggested she had fought desperately against her attacker. Underneath her fingernails, investigators recovered tiny skin particles that did not belong to Vanessa. DNA testing revealed they came from an unknown man. Detectives immediately uploaded the genetic profile into the FBI's national database, hoping for a match. But no one in the system matched the sample. Even so, the DNA became the investigation's most valuable piece of evidence. From that point on, every potential suspect's DNA could be compared against the unknown profile. Investigators also believe the killer had likely left the scene with fresh scratches and cuts after Vanessa fought back, making visible injuries another important clue. Forensic experts also examined the burn marks on Vanessa's body and detected traces of an accelerant. Laboratory testing confirmed that it was gasoline, leading investigators to believe the killer had poured fuel over the body in an attempt to destroy evidence immediately after the murder. Although medical examiners couldn't conclusively determine whether Vanessa had been sexually assaulted, detectives continued to treat sexual assault as the most likely motive. At the same time, they didn't dismiss the possibility that the attack had been personal and that the killer may have known Vanessa. Determined to identify the perpetrator, investigators turned to the local community for help. Princeton had a population of only around 3,000 people, and many residents knew one another personally. Detectives hoped someone had noticed unusual behavior or seen someone with fresh scratches shortly after the murder. Before long, that appeal produced an important lead. One witness told police that on the day Vanessa disappeared, at around 12:45 p.m., he had been driving along the same road when he noticed a dark-colored SUV parked on the shoulder, with its hood raised. Standing beside it was a Latino man of medium height with a solid build, who appeared to be somewhere between 20 and 30 years old. Because the witness drove past at full speed, he couldn't provide many additional details. The only thing he clearly remembered was that the man had either very short hair or a completely shaved head. About 90 minutes later, the witness drove back along the same road and noticed the SUV was still there. This time, however, the hood had been closed, all the windows were rolled up, and the man had disappeared. At the time, the witness hadn't thought anything of it, but after learning about Vanessa's murder, he realized he might have unknowingly seen the killer. Another witness came forward with a similarly troubling account. He reported seeing Vanessa jogging along the road that afternoon, while a vehicle appeared to be following her. According to his statement, the driver initially passed Vanessa, then turned the car around and began driving behind her again. Unfortunately, the witness couldn't make out the license plate or remember enough details to identify the vehicle. Not long afterward, detectives received another potentially significant lead. An employee at a ski resort located about 10 minutes from Princeton noticed a man with visible scratches across his face behaving suspiciously. Surveillance cameras at the resort captured clear footage of the individual, and the employee immediately handed the video over to investigators. Police quickly identified the man and launched an investigation into his possible involvement. However, after examining his movements and comparing his DNA to the biological evidence recovered from Vanessa's body, detectives determined he had no connection to the crime and officially ruled him out as a suspect. In the weeks that followed, investigators were flooded with more than 1,000 tips from the public. Several appeared extremely promising at first, but every lead eventually reached a dead end. Detectives investigated local residents, people from neighboring communities, and countless owners of dark-colored SUVs. Yet none of those inquiries brought them any closer to identifying the killer. Meanwhile, Vanessa's family refused to sit back and wait. They distributed flyers throughout nearby towns, hoping someone might remember seeing something important, and even created a dedicated website containing information about the case in an effort to generate additional leads. Despite the overwhelming public support and constant flow of tips, investigators became increasingly discouraged as the weeks passed. They had interviewed hundreds of men, collected countless DNA samples, and thoroughly examined Vanessa's relatives, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. But every promising lead ultimately went nowhere. Several FBI behavioral profilers were brought in to review the evidence. After studying every detail, they concluded that the most likely scenario was that Vanessa's killer had never known her personally. Instead, they believed the attack had been completely random, that the perpetrator had simply driven past, noticed Vanessa jogging alone, and decided to attack her. The profilers also believed the killer either lived in Princeton, resided in a nearby town, or visited the area regularly for work or to see family. Given the extreme violence of the crime, they suggested the perpetrator was likely a sociopath, someone capable of committing a brutal murder while showing little or no remorse. Such individuals often appear completely ordinary, making them exceptionally difficult to identify. According to the profilers, the killer may have returned to his normal routine immediately after the attack, behaving as though nothing had happened and avoiding any suspicion. Over the following months, the investigation made very little progress. Although detectives worked tirelessly and followed every promising lead, the more people they investigated, the less likely it seemed they would ever uncover the killer's identity. Then, 9 months after Vanessa's murder, the case took a completely unexpected turn. In April 2017, a Massachusetts State Police trooper was driving through the city of Worcester, roughly 18 miles from Princeton, when he noticed a black SUV being driven by a Latino man with very short hair. Because Vanessa's murder had been widely discussed among law enforcement, the officer immediately remembered the witness descriptions from the case. Thinking the vehicle looked remarkably similar, he quickly wrote the license plate number on his hand before the SUV disappeared from view. After returning to the station, he ran the registration and discovered the vehicle belonged to a 31-year-old man named Angelo Ortiz. He immediately forwarded the information to the detectives leading the investigation. Ortiz had no previous criminal record and had been living in Worcester with his girlfriend and their 3 children for less than a year. Detectives visited his home and requested a DNA sample. However, they quickly encountered an unexpected obstacle. When Ortiz answered the door, officers realized he spoke very little English. Fortunately, one of the detectives spoke Spanish, and Ortiz's girlfriend also helped translate during the conversation. Ortiz eventually agreed to provide a DNA sample, which was immediately submitted for forensic testing. While waiting for the laboratory results, investigators began examining Ortiz's background in greater detail. They discovered he worked as a delivery driver, transporting packages from a distribution center to post offices throughout the region. His job meant he regularly traveled through towns like Princeton and was very familiar with the surrounding roads. Detectives also obtained historical location data from Ortiz's cell phone. Although the information was based only on nearby cell towers and wasn't precise, it revealed something highly significant. On the day Vanessa was murdered, Ortiz's phone had been located in Princeton, specifically near the wooded area where her body was eventually discovered. As detectives continued digging, they uncovered another suspicious detail. Shortly after the murder, Ortiz stopped at a gas station in a neighboring town and purchased only $5 worth of gasoline. Bank records showed that instead of filling his vehicle, he had used the fuel to fill a small gas can. Investigators immediately connected this purchase to the forensic evidence recovered from Vanessa's body, where experts had found traces of gasoline. By this point, detectives strongly believed Ortiz was responsible. Soon afterward, the laboratory confirmed their suspicions. The DNA obtained from Ortiz perfectly matched the skin cells recovered from beneath Vanessa's fingernails. With definitive forensic evidence linking him to the crime, police arrested Angelo Ortiz. He denied any involvement in Vanessa's murder, forcing the case to proceed toward trial. Given the DNA evidence, cell phone records, and other circumstantial evidence, prosecutors were confident they had an exceptionally strong case. However, an unexpected legal battle soon threatened to derail the prosecution. Ortiz's attorneys argued that the DNA sample had been obtained unlawfully and should therefore be excluded from evidence. They claimed the language barrier prevented Ortiz from fully understanding what officers were asking him to sign or whether he was consenting to provide his DNA. Ortiz insisted he had signed paperwork he couldn't read and only agreed to the DNA collection because his girlfriend encouraged him to cooperate. The challenge created a serious problem for prosecutors. Even with a perfect DNA match, excluding that evidence could have severely weakened the case and potentially allowed Ortiz to walk free. After lengthy legal arguments, the judge ultimately ruled that the DNA evidence had been collected lawfully and could be presented at trial. Even after that decision, Ortiz continued maintaining his innocence, and preparations for the trial stretched on for years. Throughout the entire process, he remained behind bars because he was unable to post the $10 million bail. In total, more than 6 years passed between Vanessa's murder and the start of the legal proceedings, with repeated delays pushing the case further into the future. For Vanessa's family, every additional year of waiting only deepened their pain. During that time, investigators uncovered more information that further damaged Ortiz's reputation. Although he had lived in Worcester for less than a year, several women from his neighborhood told detectives they found him intimidating and inappropriate. According to their statements, Ortiz frequently made crude sexual remarks toward women, leaving many of them afraid to be around him. A former employee at the Princeton post office also shared troubling experiences. Because Ortiz regularly delivered packages there, she saw him almost every day. She told investigators that Ortiz often made offensive comments about her and another employee in Spanish, believing neither woman understood the language. In reality, she understood every word. She described feeling deeply uncomfortable whenever he entered the building and admitted she was genuinely frightened of him. Even more unsettling, she often walked to work along the same road where Vanessa had gone jogging on the day she was murdered. After learning about the crime, she became so traumatized that she eventually moved away from Princeton altogether. Eventually, prosecutors offered Ortiz a plea agreement. The deal gave him the possibility of being released very late in life, whereas rejecting it would almost certainly mean spending the rest of his life behind bars. After considering the offer, Ortiz accepted. In October 2022, he appeared before the court and formally pleaded guilty to Vanessa's murder. As is common with many plea agreements, he wasn't required to explain exactly how the crime occurred. He simply admitted responsibility. Although some believed the agreement was too lenient, prosecutors secured severe sentencing terms. Ortiz received a 20-year sentence for robbery after stealing Vanessa's phone and headphones, along with an additional sentence of 25 years to life for murder. Under those terms, he won't even become eligible for parole until he has served at least 45 years in prison, meaning he cannot seek release until he is approximately 81 years old. Tragically, Vanessa's father never lived to see justice served. After years of waiting for the case to reach its conclusion, he passed away from health complications just 10 days before Ortiz was sentenced. During the sentencing hearing, Vanessa's mother told the court that her former husband had died of a broken heart, overwhelmed by the grief of losing his daughter. Ortiz himself showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. Rather than speaking directly, he asked his attorney to read a prepared statement on his behalf. In it, Ortiz acknowledged that Vanessa's family viewed him as a monster, but asked them to remember that he, too, had a family who had stood by him throughout the case. He apologized only to his own relatives for the suffering he had caused them, and never expressed remorse to Vanessa's family. After the hearing, Ortiz was returned to prison, where he remains today. In the years following Vanessa's death, her loved ones chose to honor her memory by establishing an organization bearing her name. What began as a nonprofit focused on teaching women self-defense has since grown into a much broader organization dedicated to improving women's safety, preventing violence, and supporting communities through education and advocacy. Share your thoughts on this heartbreaking case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A young couple set out on what was supposed to be a simple overnight trip in a family van, but they never made it back home. As police began investigating, they uncovered several unsettling clues, yet the mystery remained unsolved for years. Then, as time passed, the families of the missing couple began receiving strange anonymous letters claiming to reveal what had happened to them. Despite those disturbing messages, investigators were no closer to solving the case. It would take decades before the shocking truth finally emerged through an unexpected breakthrough. Tanya Van Kylenborg was born on March 7, 1969, in Victoria, Canada. She grew up in a loving family alongside her older brother, with whom she shared a close bond. From an early age, Tanya adored animals and even dreamed of becoming a veterinarian one day. She also developed a passion for traveling and exploring new places. While still in high school, she visited Paris with her best friend, and the experience only strengthened her desire to see more of the world. Shortly before graduating, at the age of 18, Tanya met a young man named Jay Cook. Although they had attended the same high school, Jay was 2 years older, and the two were introduced through a mutual friend after Jay had already graduated. They quickly formed a relationship and soon began dating. Even though Tanya planned to study veterinary medicine, she decided to postpone college for a while so she could save money and travel first. After finishing high school, she found work at a local cafe and also earned extra income by walking dogs. Jay also chose not to attend college immediately after graduation. Instead, he joined his father in running the family's small heating installation business. In November 1987, Jay's father received an important order, but one essential part was unavailable from local suppliers. The closest place to purchase it was in Seattle, Washington. He initially planned to make the trip himself, but quickly realized his workload made that impossible. Instead, he asked Jay to drive to Seattle and pick up the part on his behalf. Jay happily agreed. Besides wanting to help his father, he saw the trip as an opportunity to spend more time with Tanya. The couple had only been together for around 6 months, and Jay hoped the short getaway would bring them even closer. As expected, Tanya enthusiastically accepted the invitation. Their plan was simple. They would leave Victoria early in the morning, arrive in Seattle later that day, spend the night there, and return home the following afternoon. Jay's father lent them his work van and gave Jay enough money to book a hotel room. He also provided a $700 check to purchase the heating part, along with a few $100s to cover travel expenses. Wanting to save money, however, Jay and Tanya decided they would sleep in the van instead of paying for a hotel. Although Seattle was relatively close to Victoria, the journey required crossing the border into the United States and taking 2 separate ferries, including one across the bay near Seattle. On the morning of November 18, 1987, the couple left home in the van and boarded the first ferry bound for Port Angeles. Their families expected them to return the following afternoon, but they never arrived. Almost immediately, both families became concerned. Based on the ferry schedules, Jay and Tanya should have been back by then if everything had gone according to plan. At first, however, they tried to reassure themselves by considering another possibility. Knowing the scenic route between Victoria and Seattle, they wondered if the young couple had simply decided to spend extra time sightseeing and accidentally missed one of the ferries. As more hours passed without any word from them, Tanya's parents contacted Jay's family. By that afternoon, everyone agreed that something was seriously wrong. Even so, they still clung to the hope that the couple had simply extended their trip and would soon return home. But when neither Tanya nor Jay came back that evening, or the following morning, their parents went to the local police station and officially reported them missing. Unfortunately, officers were reluctant to launch a full investigation. Tanya was 18 years old and Jay was 20. And there was no evidence suggesting they had been harmed or become victims of a crime. Detectives assumed the couple had simply chosen to take an unplanned vacation together and advised their families to wait several more days before becoming alarmed. Their parents were deeply frustrated by that response. They knew their children far too well to believe they would disappear voluntarily. Jay had important responsibilities waiting for him at his father's business and had never behaved irresponsibly before. Furthermore, if the couple had decided to stay longer, they would almost certainly have called home from one of the many public payphones available along their route. Realizing the authorities weren't moving quickly enough, Tanya's father decided to launch his own search. Together with Jay's parents, he first contacted the supplier in Seattle. The company confirmed that Jay had never arrived to collect the heating part. Employees explained they had waited several hours for him before eventually closing the order. Armed with that information, Tanya's father personally drove the entire route toward Seattle, searching for any sign of the van or his daughter. Despite covering every mile, he found nothing. Refusing to give up, he rented a helicopter and hired a pilot to search the area from the air. But even that effort proved unsuccessful. Thick forests covered much of the landscape, making it nearly impossible to spot a vehicle hidden beneath the trees. Determined to do everything possible, Tanya's father then printed hundreds of missing person flyers and traveled to Seattle himself, posting them throughout the city in hopes that someone had seen the young couple. The families continued their search for days, exhausting every resource they could think of. Eventually, the growing concern finally persuaded the local police to take the case more seriously. Even then, however, investigators still believed Jay and Tanya had likely chosen to spend time together somewhere and would eventually return on their own. As a result, the only immediate action they took was notifying law enforcement in Seattle, providing officers there with descriptions of the missing van and basic information about Tanya and Jay. On November 24, 5 days after Tanya and Jay disappeared, a man was walking through a wooded area near a small town, roughly 90 miles north of Seattle, when he noticed something unusual beneath a tree at the bottom of a steep embankment. Curious, he climbed down for a closer look and was horrified to discover the body of a young woman. He immediately contacted the police. Officers quickly arrived at the scene and found that the victim was partially unclothed. Her hands had been bound, and she had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Detectives also noticed there was very little blood around the body, leading them to believe she had been murdered elsewhere and dumped in the forest afterward. Since the victim carried no identification, investigators compared her description with recent missing persons reports. It didn't take long for them to suspect the woman was Tanya Van Cuylenborg, and they contacted her father. After arriving at the morgue, he was forced to make the heartbreaking confirmation that the victim was indeed his daughter. Detectives immediately began piecing together Tanya's final movements and soon learned she had been traveling with her boyfriend, Jay Cook, who was still missing. Their van had also vanished, raising the possibility that Jay himself might somehow be involved. His family strongly rejected that idea, insisting Jay had never shown any violent tendencies and deeply cared about Tanya. They also pointed out that Jay didn't own a firearm and would have had no easy way to obtain one. As investigators continued searching for him, they received another unexpected call. A bartender in the town of Bellingham, located about 18 miles from where Tanya's body had been discovered, reported finding a wallet and a set of keys lying on the ground outside his bar. Curious, he opened the wallet and found identification belonging to Tanya Van Cuylenborg. Initially, he assumed the owner would eventually return and simply kept the items inside the bar. But after seeing news coverage of Tanya's murder on television, he immediately realized their importance and called 911. Detectives searched the area surrounding the bar and made several disturbing discoveries. Hidden beneath the rear porch, they found multiple plastic zip ties identical to those used to bind Tanya's wrists. Nearby, officers also recovered a pair of rubber gloves and a half-emptied box of ammunition. Then, investigators noticed a parked van close to the scene. After checking its registration, they confirmed it was the same vehicle Tanya and Jay had used for their trip. Inside the van, detectives found complete disarray. The interior had clearly been ransacked, with belongings scattered everywhere. Despite the chaos, investigators recovered several important pieces of evidence, including numerous receipts that allowed them to begin reconstructing the couple's journey, along with a ferry ticket confirming they had successfully reached the Seattle area before disappearing. Detectives also realized that Tanya's camera, which she had brought along for the trip, was missing. Since it wasn't found inside the van or near her body, investigators suspected the killer had taken it. Even more importantly, the inside of the van was covered with blood. Forensic specialists collected multiple samples and sent them to the laboratory for analysis, hoping they might identify the person responsible. Although DNA technology was still in its early stages during the late 1980s, it had already begun helping solve criminal investigations. Laboratory testing in Seattle revealed 3 separate DNA samples inside the van, one belonging to Tanya, another to Jay, and a third from an unidentified man. Because the FBI's National DNA Database had not yet been created, investigators had no way of identifying the unknown individual unless they could directly compare his DNA with a suspect's sample. Even so, the forensic results convinced detectives that Jay was almost certainly another victim rather than the perpetrator, and they officially ruled him out as their primary suspect. That left investigators with 2 urgent questions. Was Jay still alive? And if not, where was he? Sadly, the answer came only 2 days later. On November 26, a group of friends went hunting in a wooded area several dozen miles from Seattle. While walking near a bridge crossing a small river, they noticed a body hidden among the bushes and immediately notified authorities. Detectives quickly identified the victim as Jay Cook. His body was covered with bruises, and medical examiners determined he had died from strangulation. Because of the extreme violence involved, investigators briefly considered the possibility that the killer had personally known Jay or held some kind of grudge against him. Based on where both bodies were discovered, detectives developed a working theory of the crime. They believed Jay had likely been murdered first near Seattle. The killer then forced Tanya into the van, drove her nearly all the way back toward the Canadian border, murdered her there, and abandoned her body in the wooded area where she was eventually found. During Tanya's autopsy, forensic experts recovered biological evidence, and DNA analysis confirmed that it belonged to the same unidentified man whose blood had been found inside the van. Once again, however, investigators had no way of determining his identity. Meanwhile, detectives continued reconstructing the couple's final journey using the receipts recovered from the van. They established that after crossing from Victoria to Port Angeles by ferry, Tanya and Jay stopped at a store to buy food before continuing toward Seattle. At some point, however, Jay apparently missed the turn leading to the quickest route into the city. A receipt placed them in the small town of Hoodsport, and the local store clerk remembered serving a young couple matching their description. According to the clerk, they had asked for directions to the ferry crossing, confirming they had become lost during their trip. The store clerk also remembered one unusual detail. She believed a man wearing a brown raincoat had been following Tanya and Jay. According to her, he entered the store shortly after the couple arrived and left almost immediately after they did, although she couldn't say where he went afterward. The next receipt investigators recovered placed Tanya and Jay at another store in the small town of Allen. From there, they continued toward the ferry near Seattle, where they purchased tickets for the crossing. Several witnesses recalled seeing the couple around the ferry terminal, but after that point, detectives were unable to trace their movements. Investigators then shifted their attention to known violent offenders living in and around Seattle, hoping one of them matched the evidence. But every lead eventually came to nothing. Despite possessing the killer's DNA, detectives had no practical way of identifying its owner. They believed the murderer was likely an experienced criminal, rather than someone committing his first violent offense. In their view, the offender may have followed Tanya and Jay for part of their journey before approaching them in Seattle, possibly asking for a ride. Once inside the van, detectives believed he pulled a gun and forced the young couple to obey his demands. Investigators also suspected the killer had intentionally left Tanya's belongings, the rubber gloves, and other items where they could easily be found as a way of taunting the police. It almost seemed as though he wanted detectives to know they would never recover his fingerprints because he had worn gloves throughout the attack. Ironically, forensic experts did recover several unidentified fingerprints from inside the van. However, detectives doubted they belonged to the killer since they believed he had carefully avoided leaving prints. At the time, those fingerprints didn't match anyone in police records, offering investigators no additional clues. For weeks, detectives continued interviewing witnesses, examining fresh leads, and investigating new suspects. But every promising direction eventually reached another dead end. Then, about a month after the murders, the investigation took a bizarre turn. In December, Tanya's and Jay's families began receiving anonymous letters and postcards from someone claiming to be the murderer. In the disturbing messages, the writer confessed to the killings, mocked the grieving families, and bragged that police would never identify him. Detectives immediately attempted to trace the sender, but the technology available at the time offered very few options. All investigators could determine was the cities from which the letters had been mailed, and that information did little to narrow down a suspect. The anonymous messages continued arriving over the following months, often during holidays, leading detectives to believe the sender intentionally chose those occasions to inflict even greater emotional pain on the victims' families. The letters were mailed from different cities and even different states, suggesting the sender traveled extensively around the country. Even so, investigators couldn't be certain the author was actually the killer. In many high-profile murder cases, disturbed individuals send fake confessions simply to torment grieving relatives, and detectives knew that possibility had to be considered. For years afterward, the investigation remained at a standstill. Detectives continued reviewing possible suspects, and even explored the theory that Tanya and Jay had fallen victim to a serial killer. That theory gained some support because two other couples had disappeared under similar circumstances in the same region during previous years. However, investigators ultimately found the similarities too weak to establish a direct connection. Over time, police arrested several serial killers operating throughout Washington state, but none of them could be linked to Tanya and Jay's murders. In 2003, detectives reopened the investigation and entered the unknown DNA profile into the newly established FBI database. Once again, there were no matches. Investigators remained convinced the killer likely had a lengthy criminal history, but believed he had either never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection or had been convicted before mandatory DNA sampling became standard practice. Another breakthrough opportunity arrived in 2010 when the case was featured on a nationally televised crime program. The broadcast generated a flood of new tips, including one particularly interesting lead. A caller claimed to know who had been sending the anonymous letters to Tanya's and Jay's families. The information led detectives to a 78-year-old man living in Seattle. During their investigation, police discovered the man had traveled extensively across the country during the years the letters were mailed, and many of his trips matched the cities shown on the postmarks. Detectives eventually concluded that he was indeed responsible for writing the letters. However, forensic testing proved he had absolutely nothing to do with the murders. His DNA didn't match either the blood found inside the van or the biological evidence recovered from Tanya's body. Investigators determined the elderly man suffered from severe mental illness and had simply inserted himself into one of the country's most notorious unsolved cases. The murders remained unsolved for several more years until 2018, when detectives learned about a company called Parabon, which specialized in creating facial reconstructions based on DNA evidence. With few other options remaining, investigators decided to give the technology a chance. Using the unknown DNA sample, Parabon produced age-progressed sketches showing what the killer might have looked like at different stages of his life. Police released the images to the media, hoping someone would recognize the face. But the sketches generated no meaningful leads. Refusing to give up, investigators embraced another emerging forensic technique: genetic genealogy. Parabon uploaded the unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases and began searching for distant relatives of the unidentified killer. Before long, analysts located someone believed to be a second cousin of the suspect. From there, they painstakingly reconstructed the family's genealogy, searching for a man who had lived in or around Seattle in 1987 and matched the expected age and background. Eventually, the family tree pointed detectives to a single individual, a 55-year-old truck driver named William Talbot II, who lived in a Seattle suburb. Before making an arrest, investigators still needed direct confirmation that his DNA matched the crime scene evidence. Detectives secretly monitored Talbot for several days until he discarded a coffee cup. They recovered it, extracted DNA from the saliva left on the rim, and compared it to the biological evidence collected 3 decades earlier. The results were a perfect match. In May 2018, nearly 30 years after Tanya and Jay disappeared, detectives finally arrested William Talbot II. He denied any involvement in the murders, and the case proceeded to trial. When the proceedings began in 2019, Talbot's defense attorneys focused heavily on challenging the DNA evidence. They argued that the biological material recovered from Tanya could have resulted from consensual sexual contact rather than murder. They also emphasized that prosecutors had no direct physical evidence placing Talbot at the scene of Jay's killing. Prosecutors, however, had another powerful piece of evidence. Back in 1987, investigators had recovered several unidentified fingerprints from the abandoned van. At the time, they matched no one in police records. More than 30 years later, those fingerprints were finally compared with Talbot's, and they matched perfectly. Another important witness also testified during the trial. A longtime friend of Talbot told jurors that he remembered seeing a brown van parked outside Talbot's house in 1987, despite knowing the vehicle didn't belong to him. Although the witness couldn't say exactly when he saw it, prosecutors argued it suggested Talbot had possession of Tanya and Jay's van around the time of the murders. Detectives also pointed out that Talbot lived only a few miles from the location where Jay's body had been discovered, indicating he was familiar with the surrounding area. None of Talbot's relatives appeared in court to support him, but many cooperated with investigators. Family members described him as an aggressive and intimidating person, whose behavior frightened even his own relatives. According to them, most family members had cut ties with Talbot years earlier after he moved away. When they learned he had been arrested for the murders, none expressed surprise that he was capable of committing such crimes. Prosecutors argued that Talbot likely approached Tanya and Jay under the pretense of needing a ride into Seattle. Once inside the van, they believed he used a firearm to force the couple into a remote location before murdering them separately, abandoning Tanya's belongings, and leaving the van in another town before disappearing without a trace. Because Talbot never confessed, many details of the crime remain unknown. Nevertheless, the overwhelming forensic and circumstantial evidence left little doubt about his guilt. In June 2019, the jury found William Talbot II guilty of both murders, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The conviction marked a historic milestone, becoming the first murder conviction in the United States secured through genetic genealogy. However, the legal battle wasn't over. Talbot's attorneys appealed, arguing that juror bias had violated his constitutional rights and prevented him from receiving a fair trial. In 2021, a judge agreed and overturned the conviction, ordering a new trial. But the following year, an appellate court reversed that decision and reinstated the original guilty verdict, ensuring Talbot remained behind bars. As for whether he committed other murders, investigators still don't know. Although Talbot had prior convictions for lesser crimes, he had never previously been charged with homicide. Even today, detectives suspect he may have been responsible for additional unsolved murders. Believing the calculated nature of Tanya and Jay's killings and his ability to avoid capture for 3 decades suggests the work of someone far more experienced than a first-time killer. Whether those questions will ever be answered remains uncertain. Share your thoughts on this remarkable case in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Let's move on to the next case. A mother left her young daughter in the care of a trusted friend for just one evening, expecting everything to be perfectly normal when she returned. Instead, she came home to a nightmare that looked more like the scene of a horror film than real life. Something horrific had taken place while she was away, and as investigators launched their inquiry, they uncovered unsettling clues along with eerie messages apparently left behind by the killer. Even so, the mystery baffled detectives for decades and remained unsolved until an unexpected breakthrough 26 years later finally exposed the truth. Robin Cornell was born on November 30th, 1978, in Florida. She grew up with an older sister under the care of her devoted mother, Jan, who raised both girls on her own after their father played little role in their lives. When Robin was 10, the family relocated to the quiet town of Cape Coral, where Jan accepted a job at a local hospital and found a home only a short walk from work. By then, Robin's older sister had moved away for college, leaving just Jan and Robin in the house. Robin quickly fell in love with her new hometown, made friends almost immediately, joined several sports teams, and adapted easily to her new school. She loved spending time outdoors exploring nature with her friends, but her greatest passion was caring for animals. On one occasion, she even rescued an injured bird, nursed it back to health, and refused to let it go until it was strong enough to fly again. John was equally pleased with the fresh start. Besides finding stable work, she began dating a man named Donald, giving herself the chance to focus on her personal life after years spent balancing work and raising her daughters alone. At the hospital, she also became close friends with a coworker named Lisa. Their friendship grew quickly, and in early May 1990, John suggested that Lisa move into the spare bedroom of her townhouse, since Lisa was struggling to afford rent on her own. Sharing the home would help both of them financially, and before long, Lisa settled in. She got along well with 11-year-old Robin and even volunteered to babysit whenever John had to work or go out. On the evening of May 9, just a week after Lisa moved in, Jan planned to spend the night at Donald's house watching a game. She initially felt guilty about leaving Robin with Lisa for the entire evening and even considered canceling, but Lisa assured her it wasn't a problem and happily offered to stay with Robin. Feeling reassured, Jan left for Donald's house, planning to return later that night because she had an early hospital shift the following morning. Instead, she accidentally fell asleep while watching television. Around 3:00 in the morning, she woke up, hurried home, and arrived at her townhouse expecting everyone to be asleep. What she found immediately struck her as strange. The front door was locked with both deadbolts, even though Lisa only had a key to one of them. As Jean tried unlocking the door, she heard footsteps inside and assumed Lisa was coming to let her in, but the sounds suddenly stopped. After knocking repeatedly with no response, she walked around to the back of the house, where she noticed the sliding glass door standing slightly open. At nearly 4 in the morning, with the house completely dark and no one answering, Jan's concern quickly turned into fear. Hoping Lisa had simply forgotten to lock the door after letting the cats out, she stepped inside. The moment she entered the kitchen, however, she realized something was terribly wrong. Family photographs of Robin and her older sister had been carefully removed from the living room wall and arranged neatly on an ironing board for no apparent reason. The rest of the house was in complete disarray, with broken and scattered belongings suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. Terrified, Jan rushed upstairs to Robin's bedroom, where she was confronted with a devastating sight. Robin was lying face down beside her bed, covered in bruises, with parts of her clothing pulled down. Jan desperately ran to her daughter, only to discover that her body was already cold. Refusing to accept the reality before her, she called for an ambulance and desperately tried to revive Robin despite knowing it was already too late. As emergency crews were dispatched, Jean's heartbreaking screams echoed through the neighborhood, waking nearby residents. Moments later, police officers arrived at the townhouse and immediately headed upstairs to Robin's bedroom, where the investigation into one of the area's most haunting unsolved murders officially began. Detectives entered Robin's bedroom and confirmed that the young girl had died. But the horror didn't end there. In another bedroom, officers discovered the body of 32-year-old Lisa lying on the bed with visible bruises as well. Both victims were transported to the medical examiner's office while investigators began processing the crime scene. It didn't take long before they uncovered several unusual pieces of evidence. Scattered around the house were multiple cigarette butts that belonged to neither Lisa nor John. On a nightstand in John's bedroom, detectives found a set of Toyota car keys that could have matched numerous models from the 1980s. Investigators couldn't determine whether the killer had accidentally left them behind or intentionally placed them there. They also concluded that the perpetrator had taken a shower inside the house after the murders, apparently to wash away blood, as the bathroom was still damp. Even more puzzling, the killer had left behind a pair of socks in the bedroom for reasons no one could explain. With Jan's assistance, detectives compiled a list of missing belongings. Lisa's driver's license, credit cards, checkbook, and a wristwatch she had planned to give her boyfriend had all disappeared. The stolen watch wasn't expensive, but it carried a deeply personal engraving expressing Lisa's love for him, making it both sentimental and easily identifiable. Investigators found the choice of stolen items extremely odd. The watch would have been difficult to sell, and the stolen credit cards could easily be traced if used, leaving detectives uncertain why someone capable of committing a brutal double homicide would risk taking such items. They also focused on the family photographs of Robin that had been carefully arranged on the ironing board, believing the display may have been a deliberate message directed either at Jan or the police. Realizing the investigation was far beyond the capabilities of the local department alone, detectives requested assistance from state investigators. Forensic specialists soon arrived with more advanced equipment and began thoroughly examining the home. They determined that the intruder had entered through a first-floor bedroom window after cutting through part of the protective screen. While searching Robin's bedroom, they located biological evidence on the bedsheets and immediately submitted it for laboratory testing. Although DNA analysis was available at the time, the technology was still relatively slow, meaning detectives would have to wait before receiving meaningful results. Meanwhile, medical examiners conducted autopsies and determined that both Robin and Lisa had died from asphyxiation. According to their findings, the attacker had brutally beaten both victims before suffocating them with pillows. They also concluded that both had been sexually assaulted, and biological material recovered from Robin's body was immediately sent for DNA analysis. Experts believed the assault likely occurred after the murders. In addition, investigators recovered a single male hair from Lisa's body, which was also forwarded to the laboratory for testing. While awaiting the forensic results, detectives began searching for possible suspects and quickly uncovered their first promising lead. Jan told investigators that for 3 consecutive nights before the murders she had been awakened by strange noises outside her home. She repeatedly heard the gate in the yard creaking and even believed someone had been trying to open the sliding glass door, although the darkness prevented her from seeing anyone. Then, on the morning of May 9, after daylight had broken, she looked out her window and saw an unfamiliar man standing outside. He smiled at her before quietly walking away. Although the encounter frightened her, Jan never contacted the police because she hadn't gotten a clear look at his face and assumed he might simply be someone who lived nearby. Since all of the townhouses were connected, detectives immediately began interviewing John's neighbors along with other nearby residents, checking the whereabouts of every man in the area on the night of the murders and requesting DNA samples wherever possible. As the investigation continued, detectives identified 19 men who could have potentially been involved in the crime. After months of interviews and background checks, that list was eventually narrowed to just 10 individuals. Yet investigators still couldn't connect any of them to the murders. When forensic experts analyzed the biological material recovered from Robin's body, her bedsheets, and the pillow, they determined that all 3 samples belonged to the same unknown man. Unfortunately, the DNA profile produced no match in the FBI database, nor did it match the samples voluntarily provided by several of the neighbors. Not everyone living nearby agreed to submit DNA, and detectives soon became particularly interested in one resident who had refused. Other neighbors told police that this man had repeatedly been seen peering through people's windows, although he had never been formally charged with any crime. Their suspicions only deepened when he abruptly moved to another state shortly after the murders. Detectives traveled all the way to Missouri to interview him, but despite their efforts, they found nothing that directly connected him to the killings. When Jan was shown his photograph, she admitted he resembled the man she had seen outside her window that morning, yet investigators still couldn't establish any evidence linking him to the crime. Another resident also recalled spotting an unfamiliar vehicle in the townhouse complex the day before the murders. According to her, the car slowly cruised through the neighborhood while a man wearing a red baseball cap sat behind the wheel. Despite extensive efforts, police were never able to identify either the driver or the vehicle. Detectives also investigated owners of Toyota vehicles compatible with the mysterious keys found inside John's bedroom. But that avenue produced no meaningful leads either. Since the killer had stolen several of Lisa's personal belongings, including the engraved watch she intended to give her boyfriend, investigators began considering whether the murders had been committed by someone who knew her personally. They thoroughly examined her boyfriend, searched for former partners, and explored anyone who may have held a grudge against her. But every lead ultimately fell apart. With no solid suspects remaining, the investigation gradually stalled. Detectives continued reviewing new names and comparing DNA samples whenever possible. Yet each promising lead eventually reached another dead end. Throughout the years, Jan repeatedly appealed to the public, hoping someone would come forward with information that could finally identify the killer. She remained especially troubled by one question. Despite investigators believing the attacker must have created considerable noise during the violent assault, none of the surrounding neighbors reported hearing anything unusual that night. The murders of Robin and Lisa received nationwide media attention, generating hundreds of tips from across the country. But none of them produced the breakthrough detectives desperately needed. About a year after the killings, investigators examined another possible suspect after a 27-year-old local man confessed to murdering 3 different people over a span of several years and openly declared that he would kill again if ever released from prison. Detectives thoroughly investigated his possible involvement in Robin and Lisa's murders, but ultimately ruled him out after finding no evidence connecting him to the case. For many years afterward, the investigation remained completely stagnant. Jan occasionally spoke with local news outlets, expressing her hope that the person responsible would someday face justice, while police insisted the case had never been forgotten despite having no new leads to pursue. In 2005, 15 years after the murders, the investigation was officially reopened. This time, the department assigned one detective to work exclusively on the case for 6 months. Despite an exhaustive review of the evidence and countless hours of investigation, he was unable to move the case any closer to being solved. Years continued to pass without progress until August 2016, when an entirely unrelated incident unexpectedly changed everything. Officers in a neighboring town, located only about 6 miles from John's neighborhood, arrested a 54-year-old man after he shot his adult son with an air rifle. Although the injuries were not life-threatening, state law required the suspect to submit a DNA sample. Once his profile was entered into the database, detectives handling Robin and Lisa's cold case received the breakthrough they had been waiting for over 2 decades. The man's DNA was a perfect match to all 3 biological samples recovered from the crime scene. His name was Joseph Ziller. Investigators immediately obtained a fresh DNA sample directly from him, so forensic experts could compare it with the original evidence that had been carefully preserved for years. Since Ziller was already in custody, investigators did not need his permission. Laboratory testing soon confirmed beyond any doubt that the biological evidence recovered from Robin's body and her bed belonged to him. At the time of the murders, Joseph Ziller had been 28 years old and already possessed a lengthy criminal record consisting primarily of lesser offenses. Detectives also discovered that just 2 months after Robin and Lisa were killed, Ziller had been arrested for selling stolen property and illegally possessing a firearm. Although he served a brief prison sentence, DNA collection laws were far more limited at the time, meaning authorities had never obtained his genetic profile, allowing him to remain unidentified for more than 26 years. At the time, DNA collection laws did not require samples from people convicted of the kinds of offenses Joseph had committed, allowing him to slip through the system for decades. He had never appeared on investigators' radar and wasn't mentioned anywhere in the original case files. Back in 1990, Joseph lived in a neighboring town, and detectives simply had no reason to know he existed. Once the DNA match was confirmed, however, authorities wasted no time arresting him, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Joseph insisted he was innocent and was held in jail while awaiting trial. Because the case involved capital punishment, pre-trial proceedings stretched on for years. The trial finally began on May 8, 2023, nearly 33 years after Robin and Lisa were murdered. With multiple DNA samples linking Joseph directly to both the crime scene and one of the victims. Many believed the case against him was overwhelming and expected the proceedings to be straightforward. Instead, Joseph's shocking behavior in court quickly became national news. Prosecutors built their case around the 3 DNA samples, arguing that the evidence proved Joseph had acted deliberately and with ample opportunity to stop himself. Rather than changing course, they said, he brutally murdered 2 victims, sexually assaulted them, stole personal belongings, carefully arranged Robin's photographs on the ironing board, and even took a shower inside the home before leaving. They also emphasized that Joseph had shown absolutely no remorse since his arrest. For nearly 7 years, he had every opportunity to confess and spare the victims' families the agony of waiting for justice. Yet he continued to deny any involvement. When the defense presented its case, Joseph's attorney had little evidence to challenge the DNA findings or prove his client's innocence. Instead, he argued that Joseph had no apparent motive and suggested someone else was responsible. He also claimed the crime appeared personal and was likely intended to hurt Jan rather than Robin or Lisa. When Joseph himself took the witness stand, the trial took an even more bizarre turn. He repeatedly shouted at jurors, insulted the prosecutor, cursed at the courtroom, and even directed abuse toward his own attorneys. Asked how his DNA ended up on Robin's bedsheets and pillow, Joseph suddenly claimed he had slept with John several months before the murders. He sarcastically added that if she had failed to wash the bedding for months, that wasn't his fault, and he insulted her in front of the court. Jan firmly denied ever meeting Joseph before his arrest, insisting she had never seen him in her life, let alone invited him into her home. The prosecution then called a forensic expert who explained that the biological evidence was unquestionably fresh and supported by laboratory documentation. Had it remained on the bedding for several months, the condition of the sample would have looked completely different. Furthermore, one of Joseph's DNA samples had been recovered from Robin's body itself, making his explanation impossible. Rather than backing down, Joseph erupted again, hurling more insults at Jan while ignoring repeated pleas from his own attorneys to remain calm. His behavior only strengthened the prosecution's case in the eyes of the jury. After deliberating for just 5 hours, jurors returned with a unanimous guilty verdict, leaving only the question of punishment. During the sentencing phase, Joseph's lawyers tried to persuade the court not to impose the death penalty. They argued that he had endured a difficult childhood under an extremely strict father, suffered from mental health issues, and had allegedly experienced memory loss following a motorcycle accident in 1998. However, multiple mental health experts who had evaluated Joseph over an extended period rejected those claims, concluding that he fully understood his actions, was capable of careful planning, and met every legal requirement for capital punishment. In late June 2023, Joseph returned to court for sentencing, but even then, he created another shocking scene. As he approached his seat, he motioned for one of his defense attorneys to lean closer as though he wanted to whisper something. Instead, he suddenly drove his elbow into the lawyer's head, forcing courtroom security to intervene and restrain him. Despite the unexpected assault, the attorney declined to file charges and continued representing Joseph until the end of the proceedings. It made no difference to the outcome. The judge sentenced Joseph to death, and he was transferred to prison, where he remains today, awaiting execution. After the sentencing, Jan and Lisa's family expressed gratitude to everyone who had helped solve the case, saying they had finally found the justice they had waited more than 3 decades to see. Although Joseph never admitted responsibility, the DNA evidence left virtually no doubt about his guilt. In February 2024, the case made headlines once again when Joseph's 32-year-old son was arrested on charges involving illegal material related to minors. If convicted, he could face a lengthy prison sentence and potentially serve it in the same correctional system where his father now awaits execution. Share your thoughts on this case in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. Thanks for watching.